Who am I?
Richard Kazimer, media veteran.
Why I got in radio is because I'm good with a knife.
Contributor in Perth, Australia.
Our friend Richard Kazimer in the United States.
How are you guys enjoying the 19th century? Is that working out for you? How can you say, I'm not making fun of you as a race, I'm making fun of you as black performers?
I think as a country, Americans are as patriotic as the most rabid UK football hooligan.
Who am I?
Richard S. Kazimer. I've often wanted to say that we do give this guy Mission Impossible, but I don't know that we really do. Sometimes it might be fair to say we give him mission, well, a little bit hard, perhaps sometimes mission very hard, but never, I think, truly Mission Impossible. We are, of course, talking about our friend Richard Kazimer from the United States. Good morning, sir.
Good morning. I hopefully am always up for the challenge, so hit me.
Something that's always a bone of contention. I imagine it's a bone of contention there, maybe in different reasons, maybe in different areas, and maybe for different reasons, but still a bone of contention nonetheless. Two issues, if you ever really want to see people get stirred up, talk about two things: the amount of money that CEOs are paid and the amount of money the politicians are paid. In Australia, that's just about the best way to send most people frothing. What's the situation over there? Firstly, let's have a look at CEOs' salaries. Does that ever come into sharp focus?
Oh, absolutely, especially in the past year or so with the obscene amount of money that the Wall Street banking industry has made and what they were doling out for bonuses, even after they were on their knees begging for a government bailout because of all the mistakes they made at the last year of the Bush administration. That really does come to focus. I'm talking millions of dollars for CEOs and then millions of dollars in yearly bonuses. And that's where now we've gotten into the thing where are politicians looking out for Main Street or for Wall Street? It definitely is a bone of contention and something that is fueling the Wall Street and the financial reform movement here in the United States.
Yeah, well, I know there's a fair amount of agitation for reform, and there's been a fair amount of talk from the President about addressing some of those issues. One kind of, and I must say I always found it rather strange that here they were going cap in hand to the government and saying, we basically need you to bail out, you know, the old line about too big to fail and all the rest of it, and you don't want banks going on under, etc., etc., etc. You kind of think at the time that they were going to the government and saying, please help us out, you kind of think, obviously erroneously, that they would also be thinking now might be the time to show a little bit of restraint in terms of financial remuneration. I mean, we all talk about bonuses for doing a good job. What about taking some money off people for doing a bad job?
The fact of the matter is, what constitutes a good job and a bad job? We have a tendency in this country, at least, to reward bad behavior and reward failure. When you look at the Wall Street bankers and some of the financial institutions, they may have been bad for the consumer, but the money that they made at the cost of the consumer went back into the pockets of the investors. It may look on one end that they were failing, but they were actually making money off of these bad investments and making money off of constituting failure and betting against the country, betting against the strength of the economy. But that's the nature of investing and Wall Street anyway. So I think that when we get a close-up look at that, warts and all, it's kind of hard for us to wrap our heads around, and then the anger ensues that these people are still making money off of the backs of everybody else that they supposedly are serving, when in fact the bottom line is they are serving the directors.
Yeah, that's all understood, but one would imagine at a time when they've gone to the government and said, we don't have enough money, we're going to fall over unless you're prepared to help us out, you kind of think at that point they might have said, now is the time to show some restraint. In a year or two we might end up paying ourselves bonuses again, but right now, whilst we've gone to the government and said, we really need you to bail us out, you kind of think that might be the time when they say, you know something, now is not the time to take a bonus even though we feel like we should.
The legality of it is the Congress and President have no legal authority to deny a private company how they dole out bonuses or if they do at all.
No, I understand that, but they do have the right to turn around and say, you know something, if you're going to take these bonuses, we are not going to hand out the money. Now, bearing in mind they had the handout for a handout, one could imagine the government could have said, well, okay, this handout is conditional on nobody receiving bonuses. They surely could have done that.
But on the other end, they did pay back the money plus interest because they make such an obscene amount of money that it really wasn't years down the line that they were going to struggle to pay back the government loan or the government bailout. They paid it back in less than a year plus interest.
Okay, in which case we could probably argue on that basis that it might have been questionable as to whether they really needed the government money in the first place or whether they just went for it because it was convenient and perhaps arguably also cheap.
Therein lies the rub. Do we focus on Main Street or do we focus on Wall Street? And that too big to fail is still thrown out there, not only for financial institutions, but something like BP, for example, and the astronomical and almost limitless amount of damage they're doing to this country. Do we go after them hardcore to make them pay up and possibly put them out of business? Or do we let everything slide and hopefully they can fix this mess?
The only arm of BP that you could probably go after is the North American arm. There is always a possibility, I suppose, you could put that into bankruptcy, but I'd have to check this, but I am pretty sure that there is something in US law that does not allow you to sue somebody into bankruptcy.
I would dispute that. It's inevitable that the amount of suits against a company would force it into bankruptcy. There's different types of bankruptcy. There's Chapter 11, Chapter 13, and so on, where a company can actually file for protection under bankruptcy until it gets its assets in order. But no, there's a history of people going total bankrupt due to lawsuits.
Mind you, of course, that doesn't achieve anything, does it?
No, it doesn't.
I mean, the bottom line, you get the satisfaction of saying I won, but the fact that the company's gone bankrupt really doesn't help. Now, interestingly, when we started to talk about CEOs' salaries and the issues and how it's felt publicly in the United States, instantly you focused on bankers' salaries. Is that really the only bone of contention in the United States, or are some of the big corporate giants also looked at and people saying, because I know that certainly is the case here, where people look at some of the salaries that people within corporations receive, CEOs within corporations receive, and they argue that these salaries are obscene. Is the same argument had in the United States, or is it pretty well focused on Wall Street?
No, I think that any time you see or hear of somebody making an astronomical amount of money, whether they earned it or not, and we can define what the term earn means or worth, people have a tendency to be jealous. The healthcare industry is one. Doctors have always been chided as making too much money or charging too much money. Software industry is a good source of astronomical amounts of income. Whether or not it's justified, I don't know. I just think that people have a tendency that when you see somebody making more than you, there's a little bit of an irritation there.
Does anybody have an idea? And actually, I've never posed this question before, but just talking to you this morning has got me thinking. Does anybody have an idea where they consider well-paid becomes obscenely paid? Is there some sort of a line, or is there some sort of term and condition that applies where you start to say, you know something, this person is not receiving a good salary, they're receiving an obscene salary, and there must somewhere be some sort of a line where that's drawn?
One man's riches is another man's poverty, depending on what your outlook is. I can cite a few examples of some of the top CEOs in this country. Warren Buffett, he's a CEO of Berkshire Hathaway, which is a...
Yeah, he's fairly well known internationally, Warren Buffett.
This man makes a ton of money, but also gives a lot of it back, most of it back, because he's made more money than he possibly can spend in his lifetime. He's a huge philanthropist. Warren Buffett and Bill Gates of Microsoft are renowned for their philanthropy. Steve Jobs of Apple took a salary a couple of years ago of $1. That was his CEO salary, but he took home $668 million because of his investments. Sumner Redstone is a media mogul here, and also is a philanthropist. They make so much money, it's just so hard to comprehend, but it's like the weather. You can do absolutely nothing about it. These people make the money, hopefully they give it back to society, and everybody's happy. It's like celebrities, we love to talk about them, but we'll never meet them. We'll never be them.
What are some of the salaries that people earn? I mean, generally speaking, taking aside some of the people that you mentioned, what are some of the other salaries that have been talked about that CEOs receive?
I'm going to answer this in the most succinct way possible for this question. It depends. An average CEO salary here in the United States is anywhere from, let's say, $96,000 to $205,000. You tack on all the bonuses, profit sharing, and commissions, and you're ending up with either short of $100,000 to $260,000. That's the national average salary for a CEO. However, it varies from market to market. There's what we call market rate here. A CEO salary in Portland, Maine is going to be lower than Boston, is going to be lower than New York, is going to be different than Atlanta, Omaha, and so on. So it's whatever the market bears. Now, the salaries themselves are determined by a salary commission board of directors, and they determine the compensation. Now, what they want to do is have a high level of CEO salaries, and it makes your company look better. Otherwise, you're going to lose a good CEO to a company that's going to outbid you. So they always want to keep the salaries higher than the national average or at the national average, preferably higher than the national average. It's different for nonprofits. profits, but not that much. If a CEO for an arts organization, a big theater or concert venue, something like that, they're pulling in some big money too. That salary has to be determined by the board of directors who are not paid and who do not get any profit sharing or anything like that, but they sign off on the yearly budget. We have a CEO here in Boston who makes $400,000 a year as a CEO of a concert venue, and he's one of the highest paid nonprofit CEOs in the country. There's been considerable debate and press as to whether or not he earns his keep. But when you look at the figures as to how much money they bring in donations, how much they go out into the community and hold classes and do education for arts groups in high schools and middle schools and things like that, it's good PR. As long as they're making a profit, whether that profit goes to shareholders or goes back into the organization, that pretty much determines that CEO's salary.
Yeah, I find it interesting because nowhere have you, apart from this one non-profit salary, nowhere have you actually mentioned some of the ideas of salaries. I mean, apart from people like Steve Jobs, for example, who obviously what they do is insignificant because, of course, their investments are driving their true income. But some of the other general salaried CEOs, what sort of figures are we talking about? I mean, I can accept that you might be talking about a range, but generally speaking, what sort of figures are we talking?
60,000 to 200,000. That's a good range for a CEO. And again, it depends on the market.
60,000
because it's whatever the market bears.
For a year. I mean, mate, if that's all CEOs were earning in this country, people would be happy. I mean, you must be talking about much higher figures than that.
That's an average. As I say, looking at the national salary data, to $96,000 to $205,000 plus all your commissions and everything and all your bonuses. That's it. These are the latest figures, but you could be doubling that or tripling that depending on the size of the market.
Now, what about when you talk about, for example, the CEO of McDonald's or IBM or Coca-Cola or something like that? They'd have to be on far more than a couple $100,000 a year plus bonuses.
Those companies are different than the CEO of a tractor company, of the CEO of a medical device company. If you're a CEO of a company that has national holdings or national locations, that's different than a CEO that may have just regional locations.
Oh, of course. Generally speaking, it's the national ones that people tend to focus on. I mean, you know, the guy who's some sort of a regional CEO, people tend not to know about so much. But the other point of interest when it comes to remuneration, which actually, when compared to some of the CEOs, is quite small, is the issue of politicians. How much politicians get paid in the United States? Has that been an issue? I know in some states, certainly at a state level, they're basically paid in some cases, I know in the state of Nevada, a very, very small honorarium. But I mean, obviously there'll be some other politicians, particularly at a federal level, who some people might consider to be quite well paid. Generally speaking, what's the view on what politicians are paid in the US?
The House and Senate, Congress people and our senators are all paid the same. They get $174,000 a year. The leaders of the House, the party leaders, get slightly more, $193,000, $223,000. The president gets $400,000 a year plus $50,000 in expense money, and the VP, the vice president, gets $227,000. That's it. That's what they get. Every year there's a cost of living raise for the senators and Congress people. They have an option of not accepting it. To this date in the history of the United States, no one's ever refused it.
You mean to say there isn't one person somewhere at some time that hasn't, for purely conscious reasons, refused a rise?
I'm sure that they have.
It's just that you don't know about it, and just that it doesn't happen often, right?
That is true. The people who are in national politics anyway have a ton of money to begin with. This isn't a poor man's game. There's a lot of people who are established lawyers, doctors, business people who get into politics for selfish reasons, for all the money they can make on the side, all the donations. That's why another big political issue is campaign financing reform, how much money you can accept from lobbyists and special interest groups. But then when you get to the state level, your local or your district politicians, that money is much, much lower. If you're in the House of Representatives, that's an average about $40,000. And then when you get into your local shire representatives, that's chump change or nothing. People do it for the goodness of their heart. And they have their own jobs anyway, their own careers.
One of the things I find interesting, though, is the state issue. It seems to vary in many instances from state to state. For example, I know that Nevada only has a part-time legislature anyway, and people there are paid basically an honorarium, whereas California's the exact opposite. It's full-time and people are paid and its expenses are fairly high and all the rest of it. Why do you see this variation from state to state? I mean, there isn't any sort of parallel or consistency, it would seem.
It's all paid for by the tax dollars. If you're in a small state or an economically depressed state, you can't pay your elected officials as much as you could with a large state like California.
I mean, I think we could argue at the moment that financially Nevada would be in better shape than California. California is virtually broke, isn't it?
Yes, but they're still hauling in the tax money.
Yeah, I suppose.
If you don't have the money to spend, people are still paying their taxes. So, for example, Schwarzenegger would take in $206,000 as a salary. The state of Maine, where I grew up, and totally at the other end of the country, Governor Baldacci takes $70,000. It's whatever your state can afford.
It always seems interesting. Is there much argument about how well the money is spent? Because, I mean, one of the things that you do seem to have in the US is you seem to have a fairly clear delineation between the tiers of government, what the responsibilities are at various different levels. How much of an argument is there about how well spent the money is? And indeed, is there ever much of an argument about politicians' salaries and whether they're in fact worth what they're being paid?
The sole criteria for determining the worth of anybody's salary is based on two factors, and that's the lowest amount the person will accept and the highest amount the company or nonprofit will pay. Period. Nothing else matters. Now, when you get into the politicians, the question remains, who are the politicians serving? The people who elected them or the special interest groups who help pay for their campaign? There's a vast difference because the voters don't pay, though they can contribute to a campaign contribution, but the majority of the money that anybody who runs for political office comes from their own coffers. They do fundraising, and much of that is from special interest groups who pay for everything. And then once they're elected, then comes the payback time, and that's where you see a lot of conflict of interest as to whether or not the person is representing the people who voted them in or big oil, big business, big banking. It just goes on and on and on.
Well, I suppose ultimately the people who decide whether they are representing their interests or they're representing their special interest group interests are the voters, and I guess ultimately they make their decision as to whether they continue to return that person to the legislature.
Every 2, 4, and 6 years we make that decision.
Yeah. Overall, though, is there a view that politicians are paid too much, not enough, or about right? Or is it one of those things that you have to assume it must be about right because you don't hear too much about it?
We don't hear much about it. We just take for granted, because it's a blanket salary, we don't know, nor does the general public care how much they're getting paid. It costs a lot of money to live in Washington, D.C., so they have to maintain a house. They're separate residents from their district back in their home state. We understand that. It's earning that money, earning that public trust is where we run into some issues. That's more important than money. Are they representing us? Are they representing their constituents? That alone is the determining factor. It's like a trivia question. How much does the president make or how much does a senator make? In the big scheme of things, it really isn't that much money. How much they get paid by the government, how much they get paid by special interest groups and lobbyists, that's another matter. That is in the millions.
Gotcha, because that's where the big area of concern comes in. All right, Richard, as always, thank you very much. Now, don't forget, if you'd like to be Richard's friend on Facebook, all you need to do is look up Richard S. Kazimer. Kazimer, by the way, is spelled Kazimer. Richard S. Kazimer. Well, you'll find him on Facebook, and if you say, I want to be your friend, he will accept you. Meantime, my friend, we'll have a chat to you next week. Thank you.
All right, brother. Go Julia.